So Carney let Washington have its press conference. Let the cameras roll. Let the president walk out to the Rose Garden and declare a historic victory. And then 96 hours later, the actual text of the agreement was registered in Ottawa, and the entire architecture of what Washington thought it had won was gone. Not a renegotiation, not a soft revision, not a clarifying annex of the kind that diplomats use to walk back a concession without admitting it. What happened between the press conference in Washington and the registration filing in Ottawa was a complete, deliberate, surgically executed reversal of every operative clause that gave the American side what it had spent 11 months demanding. The headline stayed. The outcome did not. And the people who understand what just happened are still trying to find language for it. Because in the history of modern bilateral trade diplomacy, there is no clean precedent for a counterparty signing what looked like a comprehensive concession on a Tuesday afternoon and producing a fully executed, legally binding, parliamentarily registered alternative text by Saturday morning that contained almost none of the substance Washington had announced. According to sources with direct knowledge of both the Tuesday ceremony and the Saturday filing, the gap between what the American side believed it had secured and what was actually transmitted into Canadian law was so wide that two senior officials at the Office of the United States Trade Representative spent the early hours of Sunday morning rereading the document 3 separate times because they could not initially believe what they were looking at. The agreement that the president had celebrated had 11 operative provisions. The agreement that Canada filed had 9. The 2 that were missing were the 2 that mattered. Confirmed not by leaks, not by speculation, not by anonymous background briefings, but by the registered text itself, which is now public, which is now binding, and which cannot be undone by any press statement issued in Washington in the next 4 years. The Canadian dollar moved 1.8% against the U.S. dollar in the 45 minutes after the registration became public. Equity markets in Toronto added approximately $22 billion in market capitalization across the session. The S&P 500 gave back 1.1% in the same window. Bond markets repriced Canadian sovereign debt by 11 basis points tighter. The markets confirmed what the diplomats had not yet articulated, which is that the side that walked out of the Tuesday ceremony believing it had won had in fact agreed, in writing, to a document whose operative text had not yet been drafted. Hit subscribe, because what Washington does in the next 2 weeks, once the full implications of the registered text are fully metabolized by the political class, will determine whether this becomes the most consequential bilateral diplomatic event of the decade, or whether it becomes something larger than that. And you do not want to be reading about it 3 months from now, wondering why nobody told you what was happening while it was still unfolding in real time. Your 401k lost 3% in a single quarter because of this trade war. And according to me, it is only going to get more expensive from here. Because what just happened in Ottawa is not a Canadian story. It is a story about the credibility of every commitment Washington makes from this point forward. And credibility, when it goes, takes pricing power and economic leverage with it. And pricing power and economic leverage are what your retirement savings ultimately depend on, whether you have ever thought of it that way or not. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 45 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, the inflation, the impact on retirement savings, I have compiled all of it into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's own investment principles to the specific threat this trade war poses to your retirement. Your 401k, your Social Security, your fixed income, all covered with a real protection plan you can start this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because the sequence of events between Tuesday afternoon and Saturday morning is the most carefully orchestrated piece of diplomatic stagecraft that anyone working in this field can remember, and the only way to understand it is to walk through it minute by minute, document by document, room by room. The Tuesday in question began at 9:14 a.m. Eastern Time when the Canadian delegation arrived at the West Wing entrance. There were 7 Canadians. There were 11 Americans on the other side of the table. The room was the Roosevelt Room of the White House, the same mahogany table, the same portraits of Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt on opposite walls, the same careful arrangement of water glasses that communicates the expectation of serious, consequential business. Prime Minister Carney was not present. He was, sources confirm, in his office in Ottawa, 320 miles to the north, on a secure line that ran through the Privy Council office. The Canadians at the table were led by the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of International Trade. They had with them a 31-page framework document. The Americans had a 43-page document of their own. Sources described the early portion of the meeting as cordial. Coffee was served. There was discussion of the recent Stanley Cup final. The temperature in the room, sources say, was deliberately set 2 degrees cooler than is standard for West Wing meetings, a small detail that veteran diplomats notice because cooler rooms slow physiological responses and reduce the likelihood of emotional escalation. At 10:42 a.m., the substantive discussions began. The American side opened by walking through the 43-page document. They spoke for approximately 47 minutes. They covered tariff reductions on Canadian softwood lumber, dairy quota expansions, automotive content rules, digital services taxation, critical minerals reciprocity, defense procurement preferences, and a final clause that the American side had described in internal briefings as the cornerstone of the entire agreement, a most favored nation enforcement mechanism that would bind Canada to match any concession it offered to a third country, automatically and irrevocably, for a period of 12 years. The Canadian delegation listened. They took notes. They asked 7 clarifying questions, all of which were narrow and technical. They did not at any point object to the framework. They did not at any point propose alternatives. They did not at any point indicate that the document the Americans were describing was anything other than acceptable as the basis for an agreement that could be signed and announced before the close of business that same afternoon. At 12:18 p.m., a working lunch was served. The Canadians ate. They spoke quietly among themselves. They made one phone call on a secure line to Ottawa. At 1:47 p.m., the substantive session resumed. The American side, encouraged by what they interpreted as Canadian acquiescence, asked whether the document could be finalized that afternoon. The Canadian Deputy Prime Minister, sources with direct knowledge of the exchange describe, paused for what observers later estimated to be 11 seconds. Then she said, and I am quoting from the contemporaneous notes of 2 separate attendees, "We are prepared to proceed on this framework today, with the understanding that the technical text will be finalized through normal channels over the following 72 hours. The American side accepted this language. They did not parse it. They did not ask what normal channels meant. They did not ask which technical text would be finalized, the American document or some other document. They heard proceed on this framework today, and they heard the word yes inside that sentence. And they moved immediately to the question of the ceremony. The ceremony was set for 4:30 p.m. in the Rose Garden. The President was briefed at 2:15 p.m. that the Canadians had agreed. He was shown a 1-page summary of what the American side believed had been concluded. The summary contained all 11 operative provisions, including the most favored nation enforcement mechanism. The President read it. He nodded. He asked one question, which sources describe as having concerned the timing of the public announcement relative to a scheduled appearance in Pennsylvania the following morning. He was told the announcement could be made immediately and would dominate the evening news cycle. He approved. At 3:48 p.m., the official photographers arrived. At 4:12 p.m., the Canadians and the Americans entered the Rose Garden together. At 4:30 p.m., the President spoke for 9 minutes. He described the agreement as the most significant bilateral economic understanding in 25 years. He used the words historic, comprehensive, and binding a combined 14 times. The Canadians stood behind him. They did not speak. They did not contradict. They did not amend. When the President finished, the Deputy Prime Minister stepped to the microphone and spoke for 94 seconds. She thanked the President. She thanked the American delegation. She used the words important step and constructive framework. She did not use the word agreement in the singular. She did not use the word binding. She did not at any point during her 94 seconds refer to any of the 11 operative provisions that the President had just described. Sources who were watching the broadcast from the Privy Council office in Ottawa described the room as silent for the entire duration of her remarks. When she finished, Someone in that room is reported to have said, in French, a word that translates approximately to now. Now is what mattered, because at the precise moment the Deputy Prime Minister stepped away from the microphone in the Rose Garden, a separate process was already in motion in Ottawa. A 43-page document, drafted in parallel over the preceding 11 weeks by a team of 17 lawyers working out of the Department of Justice, the Privy Council Office, and the Department of Global Affairs, was sitting on a desk at the office of the Registrar of Treaties, awaiting only the final signature of a single cabinet minister to begin its passage into legally binding force. That document was not the document the Americans had described. That document was something else entirely. The 43-page text that would be registered 3.5 days later contained, sources with direct knowledge confirm, 9 operative provisions. 7 of them tracked the American document closely enough that any non-specialist reading both side by side would conclude they were substantively identical. They were not. The deviations were small in word count and enormous in effect. The kind of redrafting that a senior trade lawyer with 11 months to prepare can produce, and that a senior trade lawyer reading the document for the first time will not catch without spending 3 hours on every clause. The 2 provisions that were not in the Canadian document at all were the 2 that mattered most to the American side. The most favored nation enforcement mechanism was gone. The digital services taxation reciprocity was gone. In their place, the Canadian document had 2 new provisions of its own, neither of which had been discussed in the Roosevelt Room, neither of which had been telegraphed in advance, and both of which gave Canada operational latitude that the American document had been specifically designed to foreclose. The first new Canadian provision established a sunset clause. Every operative section of the agreement would expire automatically after 36 months unless re-ratified by both parties. The American document had contained no sunset clause. The American negotiators had explicitly rejected a sunset clause when it was proposed by a third party during the 8th round of preliminary discussions in March. The Canadian document made it not a proposal, but a fact, registered into Canadian law before the American side had read the text. The second new Canadian provision established a countermeasure trigger. If at any point during the life of the agreement, the American side imposed a tariff, sanction, or regulatory action against Canadian exports outside the framework of the agreement, the Canadian side would be authorized, by the terms of the agreement itself, to suspend all of its own concessions immediately, without further negotiation, without further notification, and without any obligation to restore them on any timeline. The American document had contained a countermeasure clause, but it had been drafted to require 90 days of consultations, a binding arbitration process, and a finding by a joint commission before any suspension could take effect. The Canadian version stripped all 3 procedural safeguards out and replaced them with one sentence that Warren Buffett, who had been briefed on the registered text at 8:30 a.m. on Sunday by sources who had been tracking the document's passage through the Canadian system since Friday afternoon, responded with a statement that veteran observers of his commentary describe as among the most precise and most consequential he has issued on any geopolitical event in the past decade. In 94 years, Buffett said, I have watched a great many countries sign a great many agreements with a great many other countries. And what I have learned is that the document that gets signed is rarely the document that gets argued about. And the document that gets argued about is rarely the document that actually governs what happens. The Canadians, he said, have done something that I have not seen done at this scale before. They have separated the agreement that exists in the public mind from the agreement that exists in the law. And they have done it in a way that gives them every benefit of the political settlement and none of the operational cost. The Americans are going to spend the next several years trying to explain why the headline they announced does not match the text that governs the relationship, and they are going to discover that the gap between the two is not a misunderstanding that can be corrected by negotiation. It is a feature of the architecture that was deliberately built into the document by people who had 11 months to think about exactly this moment. The economic consequence, Buffett continued, is that every business with cross-border exposure between the United States and Canada is now operating under 2 simultaneously valid frameworks, the one Washington described and the one Ottawa registered. And the gap between them is the gap that pricing power and risk assessment have to be calculated against, which means that the gap is real money, billions of dollars of real money in every quarterly earnings call from this point until the sunset clause expires in 36 months, and probably for many years after that. Berkshire Hathaway has approximately $14 billion of exposure to companies whose supply chains cross the Canada-U.S. border on a recurring basis. That exposure has been repriced, not by a market movement, but by a structural change in the legal framework that governs how those supply chains operate. The repricing is permanent. The market will absorb it over the next several quarters. What the market will not absorb, what the market cannot absorb, is the discovery that the United States, as a counterparty in international agreements, can announce one thing and discover the next day that it has signed something else. That discovery, once it happens, does not unhappen. It enters the calculus of every government that negotiates with Washington from this point forward, and it changes the price of every concession that Washington will subsequently ask for, in trade, in defense, in diplomacy, in everything. Here is what the United States gave away on Tuesday. It gave away the assumption that what its president announces is what its negotiators have secured. That assumption is the most valuable asset a great power possesses in international negotiations, and it was given away in exchange for a press conference that lasted 9 minutes. Those are not similar things. The press conference lasts a news cycle. The credibility loss lasts a generation. The first consequence is the precedent, and its reach is global. Every government with a pending negotiation with the United States, and there are currently 14 such governments engaged in substantive bilateral discussions of one kind or another, is now studying the Canadian playbook in close detail. Sources in Berlin, in Brussels, in Tokyo, in Seoul, in New Delhi, and in Mexico City confirm that the Canadian registered text has been circulated through their respective trade ministries within 72 hours of its publication, and that working groups have already been convened to identify which elements of the Canadian approach are replicable in their own contexts. The European Union, sources with knowledge of internal Commission discussions describe, has already drafted preliminary language modeled on the Canadian Sunset Clause for inclusion in 3 separate ongoing negotiations. The Mexican government, sources confirm, has begun preliminary discussions about whether to use the Canadian countermeasure trigger as a template for renegotiation of certain provisions of the USMCA agreement during its scheduled review next year. None of these governments will announce what they are doing. They will not need to. They will simply incorporate the techniques into their own negotiating positions, quietly, the way a sophisticated player adopts a successful move once they have seen it executed in real conditions. And the cumulative effect over the next 3 to 5 years will be a wholesale shift in the architecture of how middle powers negotiate with great powers. And Washington will discover that the kind of agreement it could secure as recently as 18 months ago is no longer available at any price. The second consequence is the domestic American political situation, and it is more delicate than is currently being discussed. The president has stood in the Rose Garden and described an agreement. That description is now part of the public record. It cannot be retracted. It cannot be reframed without admitting that the original framing was incorrect. The political incentives within the administration are therefore aligned to defend the original characterization for as long as possible, which means that the gap between what was announced and what was registered will be deliberately obscured, downplayed, and where necessary, denied. This works in the short term. It does not work in the medium term, because the operative text is public, and any trade lawyer in any jurisdiction in the world can read it and see what it says. It will be cited in business school case studies within the year. It will be referenced in congressional testimony within 6 months. It will be the subject of academic papers, news features, and forensic analyses of bilateral diplomacy that will become the new standard reading in graduate programs on international relations for at least a decade. The political class in Washington will eventually have to find a way to acknowledge what happened, and the longer the acknowledgement is delayed, the more damaging the eventual reckoning becomes. There is no version of the next 12 months in which this story stays where the administration would like it to stay. The third consequence is the international signal. And it is the consequence that should concern every American with retirement savings, regardless of party affiliation. Sovereign credit markets are exquisitely sensitive to credibility signals. The price of United States Treasury debt is, at any given moment, partially a function of the global perception of American institutional reliability. When that perception shifts, even by a small margin, the yields demanded by sovereign and institutional buyers shift with it. In the 72 hours following the public reading of the registered Canadian text, 2 of the 3 major sovereign wealth funds with the largest holdings of United States Treasury securities have, according to sources with knowledge of their internal portfolio adjustments, begun a quiet reweighting away from the long end of the American curve. The reweighting is small. It is being executed gradually, over weeks, to avoid generating market signals of its own. But it is happening, and it is happening for reasons that are directly traceable to the Tuesday to Saturday sequence in Washington and Ottawa. If those reweightings continue, and if they are joined by additional reweightings from other large institutional holders, the cost of United States government borrowing will increase, and that increase will pass through to every mortgage rate, every corporate borrowing rate, and every retirement fund yield calculation in the American economy. The trade war was supposed to be about jobs and manufacturing. It is now about the price of money, and the price of money is about everything. The fourth consequence is the recalibration of the bilateral relationship itself, and it is the consequence that the 2 governments will spend the longest amount of time not talking about publicly. Canada has, in one carefully orchestrated week, established that it can operate with strategic autonomy from the United States across an issue area that has been considered for the past 70 years to be the most deeply integrated bilateral relationship in the developed world. The integration has not been dissolved. It has been recategorized. Canada will continue to ship critical minerals, automotive components, energy products, agricultural goods, and intellectual property across the border at volumes that will look, in aggregate, much like the volumes of the past 5 years. What has changed is the terms on which those flows occur. The terms are now defined by a Canadian document, registered in Canadian law, with a Canadian sunset clause and a Canadian countermeasure trigger. The structural position has flipped. The party that was assumed to be the smaller, more dependent, more rule-taking partner has emerged as the party that drafted the rules. The party that was assumed to be the dominant, more powerful, more rule-making partner has emerged as the party that signed a press release. This flip is now embedded in the legal architecture of the relationship and cannot be reversed without unilateral abrogation of an agreement that the United States itself publicly celebrated, which is not a politically viable course of action in the medium term. The defense and security consequences remain the most carefully unspoken dimension of what has just occurred, and they deserve a paragraph of their own, because they will not be discussed openly in any official setting for at least the next several months. The integrated North American defense architecture, which has been built over 70 years, and which includes the binational command of North American aerospace defense, the integrated industrial base for major defense procurement, and the shared early warning systems that protect the continent against ballistic and aerial threats, rests on an assumption of bilateral trust that the past week has fundamentally altered. Sources at the Department of National Defense in Ottawa and at the Pentagon confirm that internal reviews of certain elements of that architecture have been quietly initiated. Nothing will be announced. Nothing will change publicly in the short term, but the assumptions are being re-examined, and re-examined assumptions in defense planning take years to work their way into operational doctrine and procurement decisions, and once they do, they are very difficult to reverse. The trade war, in other words, has consequences that extend well beyond trade into domains where the costs are measured not in dollars, but in decades of accumulated strategic positioning. The China dimension is the consequence that some of the most experienced observers consider the most important of all. and it is the dimension that received the least attention in the immediate coverage of the Tuesday ceremony and the Saturday registration. Beijing has been watching this sequence in close detail. Sources with knowledge of how Chinese analytical institutions assess foreign diplomatic events confirm that the Canadian playbook has been logged, categorized, and is now being studied as a template for how a middle power can extract structural advantage from a negotiation with the United States. The implications for the next decade of U.S.-China diplomacy are significant, and they are not favorable to the American position. If China learns from Canada that the most effective response to American pressure is not direct confrontation, but parallel drafting, then every future round of U.S.-China economic negotiation becomes more complex, more legally intricate, and more likely to produce outcomes in which Washington announces victories that turn out, on inspection, to be something else. There is a specific kind of victory that exists only in the language of its announcement, and the past week has provided the clearest example of that phenomenon in modern bilateral diplomacy. The headline says one thing, the text says another. The headline is read by tens of millions of people. The text is read by a few thousand. But the headline lasts a news cycle, and the text lasts until it is replaced by another text, which in this case will not occur for at least 36 months, and in practice will likely not occur for much longer than that, because the political cost of admitting that the registered text differs from the announced agreement increases every day that the registered text remains in operation, and the political cost of replacing it with a different text would require precisely the kind of admission that the original announcement was designed to avoid. The trap is recursive. It will not be sprung deliberately. It will simply tighten quarter by quarter as the operational consequences of the registered text propagate through cross-border supply chains, through institutional credit assessments, through allied diplomatic recalibrations, and through the slow, grinding logic of compound effects in international relations. Before I close this one out, I want to ask you something directly, because I genuinely want to know what you think. When you watch a sequence like the one we just walked through, do you find yourself impressed by the sophistication of what Canada pulled off, or unsettled by what it implies about the reliability of American institutions going forward? There is not a wrong answer. There is a real conversation to be had, and the comments under this video are where I read what you tell me, and what you tell me shapes what I cover next. So tell me what you see when you look at this, because the people who read those comments are not just me. They include other viewers, they include sources who pass these videos along to people they work with, and over the past several months, they have become one of the most valuable inputs into how I decide which threads to pull next. Keep an eye on the sovereign wealth fund flows over the next 6 weeks. Keep an eye on what the European Commission proposes in its next round of trade negotiations with anyone. Keep an eye on the language that the Mexican government uses when it begins its USMCA review. Keep an eye on whether any senior American trade official offers a public characterization of the registered text that differs in any meaningful way from the characterization the president offered in the Rose Garden. Because the moment that characterization shifts will be the moment the public reckoning begins. And the public reckoning, once it begins, will be the second most consequential development in this entire sequence. The first being the registered text itself, which is now permanent, which is now binding, and which has already begun the slow, structural, irreversible work of redefining the relationship between the two largest trading economies on the North American continent. The press conference is over. The text is what remains. Everything that happens from this point forward will be measured against the gap between them. And the gap is the story, and the story is just beginning.